Our instructor today, Dr. Salguero, is a scholar specializing in the history of Buddhist medicine. He's the author of Buddhish, a guide to the 20 most important Buddhist ideas for the curious and skeptical, and a global history of Buddhism and medicine, among many other books. He has a Ph.D. in the history of medicine from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and teaches Buddhism, Asian medicine, and history at Penn State University of Abington College. Okay, now please enjoy the teaching. I will hand it over to Dr. Salguero.
Great, thank you, Kira. Thank you for all of the behind the scenes work that you did to make this this opportunity happen here for everybody. So, and yeah, welcome everybody. It's really great to see you. I'm just sort of like taking a look around at the tiles and seeing everybody's faces. So thanks for having your cameras on and so forth. And yeah, for those of you who are not able to, that's fine as well. No problem at all. So I do think we can use the chat a little bit more freely. I'm a college professor. I've been teaching on Zoom for many years now, so I think we can have a little sort of like Q&A and sort of conversation that you want to put in the chat would be fine. Even if that's not the normal practice for the BCBS. So what I have in store for you today is a little bit of a sort of a scholarly lecture. I'm going to talk about Buddhist medicine for I don't know, not quite an hour, but for a little while, sort of standard academic lecture length of time, and then open it up for conversation and questions and comments and just further reflections from you guys after I'm finished. So. That's what the plan is for the day. And I did want to mention before jumping in, just so that it's clear, I know that, the BCBS has a lot of different kinds of presenters and teachers and so forth come in and do these programs. And I'm here as a scholar of Buddhism, as an academic speaker, not as a practitioner or teacher of Buddhist traditions. So this isn't going to be sort of a practice session on Buddhist medicine. And if that's what you were expecting, apologies. It's going to be different than that. We're going to be not learning how to, but learning about Buddhist medicine. So I believe there are many other opportunities and many other teachers that sort of talk about the practice of Buddhist medicine. It would be interesting for you all to look up if you're particularly interested in that. But it's kind of the case that whenever you find a teacher, a Dharma teacher who's teaching about, the health benefits, mental or physical health benefits of Buddhism, you're going to be getting sort of like that person's own specific doctrinal or sectarian perspective, right? So if they're a practitioner of Chinese Buddhism, a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, you're going to hear sort of like one particular cultural perspective or one particular lineages perspective on Buddhist health benefits. So hopefully what I'm going to be able to do today is give you a broader introduction to kind of the big picture, the global history, as well as contemporary big picture of all of the different ways that Buddhism and medicine have intersected and are intersecting. And hopefully you'll walk away with a broader context in which to fit any of these kinds of individual teachings that you get from other people, right? So that's our goal today, kind of like big picture framing, historical and cultural kind of frame for things you might learn from other people. And that's my specialty. That's what I do. I'm not a Dharma teacher. I'm an academic, and I work on this kind of like big global scale. So hopefully that sounds interesting to you. If it's not and you want to hang up, that's fine. But that's what my plan is for today. So having said all that, before I flip over to my screen share, I do want to say, just, in terms of sort of an opening for our gathering here, I just do want to say that, I do personally wish all of you the best of health and well-being. And I hope that everybody is experiencing flourishing and happiness and wholeness in your life, and that you're able to feel some of that and able to experience that and share it with others. So may we all be well and healthy and happy. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to switch here to my screen share. Great. Okay, so just I already introduced myself as an academic. Just to quickly give you my context, I'm a professor of Asian history and health humanities. So this is the humanistic study of medicine, not the scientific study of medicine. So looking at how culture and society and history, and in my case, Asian culture and society and history and religion interact with health and well-being. And please do take a screenshot if you want to, or write down my email address and my website. I have a lot of links to my work and blog posts that kind of summarize my work, and recordings of lectures and so on and so forth that you can find from the website. And I'm also quite happy to answer any questions that you might have that come up, later on, that you're not able to address here, or that you think of later. Very happy to continue the conversation beyond just today. So please do reach out, and just let me know where we met, so that I know which lecture you heard of mine. But I'm quite happy to to continue the conversation later. So all right. So Kira mentioned my two most recent books. I publish in two different ways. I publish academic books, and then I publish books for non-academic readers, but I'm always trying to sort of bridge the gap. So my academic books are more accessible, and my popular books have a little bit more kind of like historical information in them, and more kind of analytical, kind of critical thinking approaches sometimes. So I wanted to point you to these two resources just in terms of more information about what I'm talking about today. So this class had, as part of the, I don't know if it was part of the invitation or if there was a link for this course for the registration and so forth, there was some supplemental information or supplemental material for this course. If you haven't accessed that, I would invite you to do that. One of the things included was a copy of one of the chapters in Buddhish, which is a chapter on well-being, just kind of like maybe demystifying some of the more seemingly esoteric ideas behind Buddhist medicine. And that's part of a larger book project that sort of is an accessible guide to what I think are kind of 20 key terms or ideas in Buddhism, presented in a way that's not doesn't necessarily require you to have already committed to Buddhism in order to get something out of it. So for the curious and skeptical, I say. On the other hand, the other book on the left, Global History of Buddhism and Medicine, this book just came out in 2022, last year. It's a academic book, but it's written for undergraduate students. So I think, you could definitely, ordinary readers could read it. It's not like a super dry academic tome. But this book provides actually a whole history of the intersections between Buddhism and medicine in much more detail than we get into today. Sort of a deep dive into how early Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, in how they think about health and the body and illness and well-being, and then following, from the time of the Buddha to the present, following sort of a historical trajectory of that story of the development of those intersections between Buddhism and medicine, and touching on all kinds of different cultures, all kinds of different traditions, kind of ending with, beginning with the Buddha and the suttas and sort of like the early monastic community, and finishing with like brain scans and the internet. So sort of everything in between, giving a quick rundown with a lot of a lot of bibliographic citations and so forth, so that you can like follow up on topics that you're interested in. So just wanted to point these out as sort of like the two things I would recommend that you pick up, after this session if you want more information. This, just to say, this topic is a very large topic with a very complex history across many different Asian cultures and around and globally today. And there's just so much to learn about, to think about and explore in this arena, that it could keep you busy for decades. I myself have been working on some aspect of Buddhism and medicine since, like 20 years, 25, 26 years now. And there's still more to learn. So it's really a really fun, interesting, and very fulfilling area to study. So my own background is, and I talk a little bit about this in Buddhish, is before I was an academic, I was a Buddhist practitioner, very interested in Buddhism, and I traveled to Thailand, and I spent about 4 years on and off living in Thailand. And during that time, I spent a while at a Buddhist monastery. I spent a lot of time at meditation centers, and just kind of absorbing Thai culture and Theravada Buddhist culture more generally. One of the things that really drew me at the time was the practice of traditional Thai medicine, which I dove into, became a trained practitioner of Thai medicine. And the intersections between medicine and Buddhism in Thailand were so clear and so compelling that my learning of Buddhism and healing were sort of like, completely intertwined with each other. After about 4.5, 5 years, I decided there was kind of like a fork in the road, and I decided to return to the US and go into graduate school and become more down the academic path as opposed to a practitioner path. But I have, maintained sort of an attitude or belief that the kind of the bridging between practitioners and scholars is a really productive and interesting conversation. It's one of the reasons I publish kind of on both sides, and I continue to have conversations like this one on both sides of, the practitioner / scholar divide, right? So I'm hoping to bring to you some perspectives from the scholarly side that might be helpful in sort of like thinking about and understanding practice better. And that's my intention for today. And so I think, all of this setup that I'm doing right now is just to show you sort of where my position is in all of this and what my background is, so that you kind of are clear about what I know and can talk about, the things I don't know and don't tend not to talk about. Yeah, so with all of that framing done and all of that sort of preliminary commenting out of the way, let me jump into what the sort of the meat of the lecture is. So I want to define the term Buddhist medicine, because it may be that you've come across that term before, and people sometimes use it in very specific ways. I've actually seen a lot of practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism use Buddhist medicine to exclusively refer to Tibetan traditional medicine. I've sometimes heard, scholars use Buddhist medicine to refer to Indian medicine when it's practiced in China, right? So there's kind of like a range of different things people could mean by Buddhist medicine. So when I say Buddhist medicine, what I'm talking about is actually a cross-cultural category. So what I'm talking about when I say Buddhist medicine is similar to what I would mean if I was talking about Buddhist art. And so on this slide, you see 4 different examples of Buddhist art. They're examples from manuscripts from medieval China. Actually, the Dunhuang is on the Silk Roads, far western China. You have, going around the circle, you have a Tibetan Tanka painting from the 17th century in Tibet. You have a stone inscription, now I'm on the bottom left, a stone inscription from 19th century Bangkok, and a wooden plaque from, I forget, 2014, 2015 in Northern California. And all of these are examples of Buddhist art, even though they're being produced in completely different cultural contexts and completely different times and places, even in different styles. But we can call them Buddhist art because they're being produced by Buddhists within a Buddhist tradition or institution or Buddhist context. And so, if we focus on their differences, we could say that one is very Chinese, one is very Thai, one is very Tibetan, right? But if we focus on what they share as being examples of Buddhist art, then it brings out some interesting comparisons between them. We might compare, for example, I don't know, the way the ears are being drawn, on the figures in all of these cases, or we might compare how the institutional context in which they were produced might have some similarities. They all were produced within monasteries, right, by skilled artists, right? So we could talk about that context. Anyway, all of that is exactly parallel to how I'm going to use the term Buddhist medicine. So I'm not referring to any particular Buddhist tradition. I'm referring to all of the various ways that Buddhists all over the world throughout history have engaged with medicine. And, they did so in different ways. And there isn't one Buddhist tradition of medicine that all Buddhists have followed. There's been drastic differences between them. But yet, if you place them side by side and put them under a single category, then you can draw these kinds of cross-cultural comparisons between them. So it turns out these 4 pictures are also pictures of 4 different kinds of Buddhist medicine. So upper left manuscript from Dunhuang is a manual for expelling disease-causing demons. The Thangka painting on the upper right is a painting of the heart chakra and the movements of energies throughout the body. The stone inscription on the lower left is a diagram that shows how a massage therapist should push on certain points in order to affect the physical body. And on the right, we have the plaque is for a center that has both hospice, end-of-life care, and also a number of different programs related to health and well-being. Right. So these are 4 different kinds of Buddhist engagements with medicine from 4 very different cultural contexts, different times, places, and yet my argument is that there's something shared between them when we look globally across all of the different cultures that have absorbed Buddhism. We find medicine and healthcare being practiced alongside Buddhism everywhere, all over the world. Everywhere Buddhism goes, everywhere Buddhism spreads, there's some kind of dimension of Buddhism that is intersecting with health and medicine. And when we stand back and look at all of that cross-culturally, we see it's not really about one particular tradition. It's about a diversity of different traditions, different ways, different interpretations that have some similarities while they have a lot of local differences. So I want to start from that perspective, from the broad intercultural, cross-cultural, global perspective, and not from the perspective of one particular tradition or manifestation of Buddhist medicine. Okay, so if we talk about just really broadly, Buddhist medicine in this broadest concept, there are some elements or some ingredients of Buddhist medicine that I think we can say are shared. So all across Asia and including in the modern world, as Buddhism has become global, there are elements of Buddhism elements of Buddhist engagements with medicine that we see again and again and again. So the first one is just to mention sort of like some basic orientations. Whenever Buddhists talk about health and healing, they tend to talk about health, healing, medicine, etc., from a different orientation than other forms of healthcare or other traditions of medicine. So, for example, one of the key orienting principles in Buddhist medicine is about compassion. And, the extent to which compassion is important within Buddhist traditions, it becomes magnified even more so within Buddhist medicine traditions, as a basic sort of, orientation for why you're engaging in medicine to begin with in the first place. Another basic orientation is that Buddhism often defines itself as the solution for human suffering. I'm sure you've heard that before from whatever Buddhist tradition you belong to. Buddhism as a solution for human suffering is kind of a really common way for Buddhism to talk about itself. And then when different schools of Buddhism talk about, well, what exactly is human suffering? They give you various lists. There's sometimes 4, there's sometimes 8. Different traditions of Buddhism always list things differently. But even in the core story of the Buddha, when the Buddha, before he's the Buddha, he's the prince, and he sneaks out of the palace and he encounters 4 different things that really kind of shock him to his core, and it's old age, sickness, and death, and then the teaching about rebirth is the 4th kind of shocking form of human suffering, right? And so these 4 basic forms of suffering include illness is one of them, right? So right from the very sort of beginning of Buddhist thought, overcoming the suffering of illness is built into the tradition. Now, sometimes that's metaphorical or it's philosophical, right? Overcoming illness through detachment or through, a recognition that, the body's impermanent and so forth. So it's more of a philosophical intervention, but often it's quite literal. And Buddhist traditions all over the world have created specific literal medical interventions in order to alleviate the suffering of illness. So just before I get into some of those specifics, just one more kind of area of similarity related to what I was just talking about with the basic orientations is the way that Buddhist traditions use metaphors, similes, and analogies to equate the Buddha to the great doctor, or the Dharma to the great medicine. Sometimes the Sangha is related to, they're like the nurses that are going to help the patients recover. And of course, the patients are us, the people who are, suffering from this illness. So there's a lot of use of metaphors across Buddhist traditions that kind of play on this. Buddhism is a form of medicine metaphorically. And that's something that you can see, shared across different languages and so forth. And then you find a lot of narratives and parables within Buddhist traditions around the world, where it's the Buddha healing somebody, or one of the members of the Sangha healing somebody, or it's a Buddhist deity like a bodhisattva, healing, or it's one of the Buddhas, within Mahayana tradition. There's a lot of different Buddhas that might do healing of various types. There's a lot of stories related to the Master of Medicines Buddha, who you see in the image here, and other sort of Buddhist figures that are engaging in various different types of health practices and healing practices. And so these narratives and parallels are all over the Buddhist tradition. We have many, many, many examples from throughout history. Another similarity is between different forms of Buddhist medicine around the world is the frequent, not always, but the frequent organization of the practitioners of Buddhist medicine into formal lineages. So, within Thailand, which is where I studied traditional medicine, we did twice a day at the traditional medicine hospital, we did a ceremony sort of like giving thanks to the lineage of teachers that came before us, all the way back to the Buddha's doctor, right? There's this figure from the Pali Canon named Jivaka Komar Bacha, who's in the Pali stories, he heals the Buddha, and he like dedicates his medical expertise to helping the Sangha. And so there we were, in the 1990s, early 2000s, right, at a modern traditional medicine hospital, still identifying as members of this lineage that was, 2,400 years old or whatever, going back to the time of the Buddha. And that's not uncommon. You find that sort of thing in Tibet and in other Buddhist cultures as well, where practitioners of health and healing practices see themselves as being part of a Buddhist lineage of medicine. So my expertise as a scholar is, even though I spent time in Thailand and so forth, and did some practice, my expertise as a scholar is not actually in contemporary Buddhism so much as it is in historical Buddhism. So my Ph.D. is in the history of medicine, and for my Ph.D. I study primarily medieval Chinese Buddhist sutras and other kinds of texts. There are texts from other contexts as well, as I'm sure everybody here knows. We have lots of texts in Pali and Sanskrit and Tibetan and other Asian languages from Buddhist traditions, throughout history. And it turns out that actually a significant segment of the texts within the sort of overall Buddhist corpus actually relate to medicine and have advice and teachings about health and healing. So I did a survey of the Chinese texts, which are the ones that I know about from the medieval period, and we have about 100 different titles, different texts that give teachings on medicine, that not just mentioning medicine in passing, but actually having like quite a bit to say about health and healing. So nearly 100 texts from medieval China, and there's actually more from Tibet, and it's quite a large quantity of material for a scholar to be able to translate and understand and put into context and so forth within one lifetime. So the study of Buddhist medicine is more of a sort of collaboration between different scholars who can read different languages and sort of access all of these texts from all these different cultures and translate them and put them side by side. And if you look into some of my publications and some of my professional activity, this is what I've been fostering for several decades now, this kind of collaboration between scholars to deal with this material together, comparing notes and comparing across cultures. So I've done a couple of collections of translations. They're rather expensive academic anthologies, but they are published. And if you're interested in reading a chapter from one of those anthologies and you feel like it's inaccessible to you, then just send me an email. I'm happy to share a chapter or two with you. But I also have a podcast and also have various other projects, conferences, and so forth that I've put together in order to kind of bring together the community of scholars, bring together a community of scholars around the topic of Buddhist medicine to do this kind of comparison of texts together. So one of the things I'm interested in those particular texts is that there are actually specific Buddhist medical doctrines. So, Buddhist usages or interpretations of medical terminology, they tend to be culture specific. So Chinese Buddhists use obviously different vocabulary than Tibetan Buddhists, but you can find, within Buddhist texts, you can find a lot of conversation around specific medical doctrines and how should we interpret these, within a Buddhist context. How should we understand these? How should we use them? And one of the things that I explore in the global history of Buddhism and medicine, that book, is how all of these things I'm talking about here, the practitioners, the lineages, the texts, and then the specific doctrines, specific approaches get kind of concentrated within particular institutions. So historically, there are temples or monastic universities even around the world that have become famous for their engagement with health and healing. And so you have examples like Nalanda in India. You may have heard of this early monastic university. It was an international group of students that came from all over the world to practice and to learn at Nalanda. And one of the things that we're teaching there was medicine. And so it's a Buddhist monastic university with an international student population, all learning Indian Buddhist approaches to health and healing, right? And then they would go back home to whatever their home country was, and would carry this Indian Buddhist knowledge with them back to their home countries. and established new institutions where they practiced, these kinds of practices back home. And so this kind of know-how, this kind of understanding how to do things, understanding how to approach the practice of Buddhist medicine spread globally, well, throughout Asia anyway. When I say globally at this time period, I mean throughout Asia and after around the world, through the influence of these kind of nodes of learning, these locations where know-how and expertise was gathered and practiced over time. Another thing that we can kind of trace the spread and the evolution of within Buddhist networks and Buddhist institutions is the use of pharmaceuticals. So by pharmaceuticals, historically, I'm talking about herbs and spices and other animal products and other kinds of things that Buddhists may have been using for, as medicines. Of course, in the modern day, we have Tibetan Buddhist pills being produced in Tibet and in parts of India and so forth, where they produce these pills that combinations of all these herbs, and they do blessings on them and so forth. And now they're sort of distributed throughout the internet. We have all kinds of other examples from other cultures where it could actually be modern pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical medicines that have been blessed through certain rituals that are being distributed. So what we mean by pharmaceuticals might change over time and be different from place to place. But certainly there have been networks of Buddhist exchanges of pharmaceuticals back, all the way to the very earliest texts we have from India, from the Buddhist tradition, where the Vinaya, or the monastic code, the disciplinary code for monks and nuns, is full of information about specific pharmaceuticals that were allowed to be used, how they were allowed to be stored, how often they were allowed to be taken, so on and so forth. And then just broadening out a little bit to material culture more generally. Material culture just means like stuff, objects and artifacts and things. Beyond just pharmaceuticals, there's other kinds of objects and artifacts that are used medicinally. One example is surgical tools, right? Scalpels and things like that have been found at Buddhist archaeological sites. Other kinds of, talismans and other kinds of materials related to health and well-being that we have discovered, throughout the Buddhist network all around Asia. And there's finally also the iconography. So we can look at similarities between different cultures in the way that they depict heroes, deities, other figures who have some relevance for medicine. So iconography is the ways that these figures are depicted within Buddhist traditions. Like, for example, the medicine Buddha that you see on the right here, in Tibet always has blue skin, right? And in most contexts in Tibet, he's holding, in the Himalayan Buddhism anyway, he's holding in his hand a bowl with a medicinal fruit in it. And that kind of iconographic traditions of how do you depict a medicine Buddha, or how do you depict the Buddha's doctor Jivaka, who I mentioned earlier, or how do you depict different kinds of medicinal narratives or parables or so forth. You have this tradition of iconography, and then you can see how these traditions spread from place to place. Like, how did the Indian depictions spread to the Silk Roads, and how does the Chinese depictions kind of spread to Japan? And you can look at through art history, you can look at the spread of certain ways of depicting medicine within these Buddhist networks. So finally, the last thing, and it's sort of the transition to the next slide, is a repertoire of practices. So I've kind of insinuated this, but haven't actually said it, that there's a whole set of practices that are practiced within Buddhist contexts. So specific kinds of health and healing practices that are particular to the Buddhist context. They might have similarities with what other people do, but there's a specifically Buddhist way of doing them. That's what I mean by a repertoire, right? A repertoire of practices. And so the repertoire of practices is actually one of the things I'm most interested in studying as a scholar. So looking at how particular practices maybe originate in India, then they wind up being done in China, they wind up being done on the Silk Roads, they wind up being done in Southeast Asia, they wind up being done in Japan, maybe done in slightly different ways, but there's sort of like a particular collection of practices that you find again and again and again and again in all these different contexts. The specifics vary, but the actual core set of practices is the same. And so this slide is going to get into what that repertoire actually is. So a lot of people will be familiar with the use of meditation for health and well-being. This is, of course, like mindfulness these days is everywhere. And this is, of course, many people's first exposure to Buddhism these days in the West anyway, is through meditation and its healthcare claims. Meditation of all kinds have been done for health and healing purposes since the beginning of Buddhist tradition. There's a very rich collection of different practices that have been done, all kinds of different shamatas and vipassanas and jhanas and samadhis and on and on and on, visualizations, all kinds of different meditation practices beyond just mindfulness that have been related to health and well-being. There is a collection of surgical knowledge, of surgical procedures that was historically associated with Buddhism. This is more of a historical point here, but there were certain surgical procedures like removal of cataracts and trepanation, and also intestinal washing, taking the intestines out of the body and and washing them out, clearing them out with water to clear obstructions, that you see repeated again and again and again in early Buddhist texts. And yes, they were doing surgery in Asia all the way 2,000 years ago. That was being done. So this is not just kind of like imaginary surgery, although some of it might be. There's also very specific surgical procedures that were carried in Buddhist hands. There's multiple types of dietary practices, including both fasting, vegetarianism, that are prescribed again and again in different Buddhist contexts for health purposes. Another kind of dietary practice is specific foods or drinks that are being prescribed as antidotes for the factors of illness. The factors of illness are known as tridosha. I see I have a typo in my slide there, tridosha with a D, tridosha. These are the factors of illness that affect human bodies: wind, bile, and phlegm. And then there's specific medicinals that you take in order to have an antidote for that. There's also specific mental or emotional interventions that you do. So like, for example, if your bile dosha is too high, you would engage in metta bhavana practices or the Brahma Vihara practices in order to reduce your pitta dosha. So things like that you find repeatedly in texts all over the Buddhist world. The chanting of scriptures, particular scriptures for health and well-being, the Medicine Buddha Sutra, there's the Guanyin or Avalokiteshvara, Great Compassion mantra, which is chanted. There's other texts that are frequently selected as being, this is the text we chant for the alleviation of illness. Part of one of the things you're doing when you're chanting scripture is invoking the presence of healing deities. So this can be done in different ways, but different ways in different cultures, different deities in different cultures. But the commonality is that there's some kind of ritual where the practitioners are invoking the presence of that healing deity into the space in order to help heal the patient. So this is something that we were doing in Thailand with the spirit of the Buddha's doctor, Jivaka. But in other cultures, they may do it with the medicine Buddha. Other cultures might do it with Amitofo or Amitabha or Guanyin, Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezig, other kinds of deities. When you're trying to invoke healing powers or invoke healing within a space, you can also empower objects with the healing power. So empowering the medicines themselves, empowering water that can be drunk or can be sprinkled on the patient, empowering medicinal objects. In Thailand, we used to empower our tools that we used for massage right? So you can empower all sorts of different things using sort of the blessings of the deities that you've invoked. You put the power into the objects and then use the objects in the healing context. So kind of the opposite of invocation is exorcism. So invoking the blessings of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and they're getting their presence into the space and so forth is, you're bringing something in. Exorcism is you're removing something. So removing ghosts and demons and evil spirits and all of that sort of, bad energies and so forth is a major concern all across the Buddhist world, throughout all historical periods and today. Again, done differently in different places. The spirits are thought about differently. The ghosts might be different, right? But the sort of the basic logic of removing them and some of the ways that they're removed are similar across the Buddhist world. One of the most common ways to protect people against becoming ill is through the use of talismans, amulets, and so forth. So I have pictures on the right-hand side of the slide here, healing talismans from medieval China. I'm thinking I should have updated this slide to show you some pictures. You can Google this and see, but show you some pictures of the kinds of face mask talismans that people were wearing in Asia, Buddhists were wearing, that had, during COVID and still now, that have the mask. It was a regular mask, but then had a talisman printed on it. So it was both protecting you sort of like from the biomedical virus, but then also protecting you against the evil spirit of corona, right? So kind of like working on both of those interpretations of medicine, both kind of a modern biomedical interpretation and also a ghost or spirit-based interpretation of what COVID was all about simultaneously. So still very much in practice today. Incantation of dharanis or mantras or names of Buddhas or deities and so forth can really be used either to empower or to exercise. You can use them in both ways. Power incantations are specific to the language, right? They're different in Chinese than they are in Tibetan or Thai or so forth, but there's a common logic again there. Binding rites is attaching good luck, good karma, good spirits to your body, often done through wrist wrapping. This you can find all over Asia, all over different Buddhist cultures, where you have a blessing wrapped to your wrist in order to keep it attached to your body. There can be binding of other parts of your body as well. And then finally, a whole sort of range of different rituals of karmic cleansing. So, if one of the reasons you might have an illness is because of bad karma, then, you can do these rituals in order to rituals of repentance and confession and cleansing and so forth to remove the bad karma so that you will become well or you don't get sick in the first place. So these, again, follow different structures and different cultures, have different ways of being done, but the basic idea is shared. So I want to just kind of like shift for a moment. So I've been talking about like what are the shared ingredients of Buddhist medicine? Like, what does it look like more broadly? And now I want to kind of like show you the trajectory of history. Just 3 quick slides on that. The trajectory of history over time, how Buddhist medicine sort of affected Asian history. And the first thing to talk about is I'm sure all of you are aware of the spread of Buddhism, beginning in the northeastern corner of India, in this region, Magadha. And I don't know if you can see my cursor sort of like hovering over Magadha, but it's this area of northeastern India on the border of what today is Nepal that was the original location for the emergence of Buddhism. Probably around 400 BCE, so 2,400 years ago. And then moving forward from that, the next 600 or 700 or 800 years is really the story of the expansion of Buddhism, first all over the Indian subcontinent, and then following the trade routes that you see mapped out here on this map, across the Silk Roads into East Asia, down around the maritime routes around Southeast Asia, And, the spread was both west and east. So, by 600 or 700 CE, so that's just 1300 years ago, Buddhism had been influential from parts of Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way to Japan, and from, Mongolia down to Indonesia. So a huge area of Asian, the Asian continent was affected very strongly by Buddhism. And what I lay out in the global history of Buddhism in that book is how Buddhist medicine was a factor in all of these places. So everywhere that Buddhism went, Buddhist medicine also went. It's sort of like Buddhist medical ideas and practices and all the things I talked about in the previous two slides hitched a ride along with Buddhism and spread all around Asia. And so we often say, I don't know if people say this anymore, but I have heard in the past people describe Buddhism as being like the first world religion. If that's true, then Buddhist medicine is the first world medicine. Buddhist medicine spread far more widely and far more rapidly than any other form of pre-modern medicine. Western medicine was also influential. Greco-Roman medicine spread to the Islamic world, spread all over Europe, but the territory for the spread of Buddhist medicine is far vaster by looking at this map. And so Buddhist medicine actually turns out to be like a major influence in the global history of medicine. So that's all in the first millennium, right? The up to the year 1000. Now, from the year 1000 onwards, the second millennium, so that's the last 1000 years, there's a process that I call localization. I'm just going to quickly sort of summarize this for you. There's a lot more information in the book. And the little bubbles I put on the screen here are not like very accurate bubbles. They're just meant to sort of suggest territory. And so there's three patterns I'm going to talk about how Buddhist medicine sort of like got localized in different parts of Asia in this second millennium. The first pattern is that there are significant parts of this Buddhist world, the Buddhist world of the first millennium. There's significant parts of it that stopped being Buddhist in the second millennium, either because they were converted to Islam or they converted to Hinduism. So in either case, whether they converted to Islam or Hinduism, Buddhist medicine sort of ceased to be a major influence in India, in Iran, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, in Indonesia. It really ceased to be a major influence in the second millennium. Meanwhile, there's a second pattern that I call domestication that took place in East Asia. So that's China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, where Buddhist medicine it was very popular in the first millennium, and it continued to be popular. It didn't die out. But what happened was it got domesticated and explained and talked about in East Asian ways. And so Buddhist medicine in this part of the world, when it's being talked about in the second millennium, it tends to be talked about using Chinese ideas, qi and yin yang and the 5 phases and other kinds of Chinese ideas. That's the primary way people talked about Buddhist medicine. Localized, right? Domesticated. Then there's a third trajectory where traditions from India, originating in India and carried to other cultures, didn't die out and they didn't become domesticated, but they actually, the Indian ideas formed the nucleus for the development of regionally specific forms of Buddhist medicine that continue with this Indian influence and this Buddhist kind of framing. They continue till today. And so here my bubbles are sort of meant to capture Mongolian traditional medicine, Tibetan traditional medicine, Thai traditional medicine, Burmese traditional medicine from the country of Myanmar, Cambodian traditional medicine, and Sri Lankan traditional medicine. So all of these are forms of traditional medicine still practiced today in those countries that are explicitly Buddhist and where the basic theory comes from India. So they borrowed the basics from India, they've often also incorporated things from China and things from other parts of the world. Tibetan medicine is actually very eclectic, incorporating stuff from the Muslim world as well, Arabic medicine. So they have other influences, but the core is Indian medical theory. And then the traditions of medicine are very firmly allied with the Buddhist power structures, with Buddhist institutions, and with Buddhist philosophies. So you find that this is sort of like three broadly speaking, three trajectories that you can find in the second millennium. And then I want to get to sort of more recent history. This is my last history slide, just to talk about the modernization and the globalization process of Buddhist medicine in the 19th and 21st century. So in the 19th century, some of you are familiar probably with the history of colonialism in Asia, and you may be aware of the fact that that Buddhist traditions were largely frowned upon by colonial authorities because they were considered to be superstitious, backwards, kind of like, only Christianity was and Western medicine were correct. And so Buddhist medical approaches were often stamped out or repressed by colonial authorities. And then even in countries that weren't colonized, there often was a local government that was repressing these ideas. So, places like Thailand and Japan that never were colonized, nevertheless, they still outlawed Buddhist approaches to medicine, many traditional approaches to medicine in this time period. So in the first half of the 20th century, though, things started to change a little bit, and you started to find some Buddhist apologists. So that means Buddhists who actually were arguing, no, actually, you know what? Buddhism does have something to contribute in a modern scientific world, something to contribute to the modern scientific world. So in the first half of the 20th century, many Buddhists started to argue, this is Asian Buddhists started to argue, no, actually Buddhist meditation, isn't so much about enlightenment and so forth. It's about psychological well-being, right? Or Buddhist approaches to health and healing, have a scientific basis to them. And so I'll just give you a really quick example is Taishu, whose photo is in the upper right-hand corner. And he, for example, he made the argument in the 1920s or 30s that there's some passages in Buddhist texts that talk about tiny little parasites that live in the body that sort of like eat away at your strength and so forth. And there's some passages in the Buddhist texts that talk about these parasites as being so tiny, there's like millions of them in a glass of water, or tens of thousands of them in a glass of water. So these passages, Taishu picks them out of the Buddhist corpus and argues like, look, see, this is evidence that the Buddha knew about bacteria long before bacteria were discovered, quote unquote, by European, scientists with their microscopes. The Buddha could see that. And so that's making an argument, right, that Buddhism is compatible with science, not against science, or not backwards and superstitious, like the colonial authorities originally were arguing. So there's this kind of like repression of Buddhism that's then followed by this resurgence of Buddhism in a new sort of like scientific mode, right? And so these Buddhist ideas about health and healing get kind of like rebranded as being scientific in nature, as being, scientifically verifiable. And you start to see in China and Japan, people are arguing that there is this tradition of Buddhist medicine that should be studied and should be recognized alongside Western medicine, right? Or as equally valid, equally effective as Western medicine. And so I trace this story that I'm telling so far as sort of like the backstory for the development since the 1970s of scientific protocols for studying things like mindfulness-based stress reduction and other kinds of meditation protocols that people are using these days to study to study meditation in the clinic, to do clinical studies and medical trials of these practices, right? We're doing that now primarily in the West, although some of that scholarship is also happening in Asia. But it's really on the basis of this 20th century move to reinterpreting Buddhism along scientific lines, that this is kind of like the latest sort of chapter in that trajectory, in that development. And so I wanted to mention, just finishing up, talking about the present, just mention that there are today numerous very large transnational organizations that are promoting different versions of Buddhist medicine around the world today. These organizations became very active and very visible during the pandemic. And if you dig around on my website enough, you'll eventually land on some materials that I've collected about Buddhism in the pandemic and the Buddhist responses to COVID and so forth, that I won't have time to get into here. But a lot of the Buddhist responses to COVID mobilized the same Buddhist therapies that we've been talking about, talismans and exorcisms and invocations and dietary practices and meditation and all of the above. And a lot of this was being promoted through these large international Buddhist organizations. Probably the biggest of them, or one of the biggest of them anyway, is the Tzu Chi Foundation based out of Taiwan. And they did a ton of fundraising around COVID. And Tzu Chi is, long before COVID, they have been involved in medicine. And the picture actually shows the Tzu Chi temple headquarters in the foreground. In the background, you can see this massive hospital that they have built at their headquarters. And they've done this all over Taiwan, and they run actually medical clinics all over the world. I've visited one in Los Angeles where they have a whole operation where they're doing charitable medical work, including surgeries and dental care and eye care and basic health care for migrant workers. So these are free clinics. And it's very much, one example out of many of how Buddhism today is still like very intertwined with medicine and health and healing beyond just mindfulness, right? There's all of these other health-related activities taking place within Buddhist circles. Okay, so I have a conclusion for you real quick, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I'm going to go through these slides super quickly just to be like suggestive of like, what does all of this like kind of open up for us as contemporary people interested in Buddhism? Like, what does this story of Buddhist medicine open up for us? So of course it opens up the possibility that you might learn practices that are good for your health. That's something that you all might be interested in. I said I wasn't really going to talk about like the doing specifically today, but what other kinds of like, perspective shifts, or what kinds of like new awarenesses can open up through the understanding about what I've been talking about today? Just going to give you a handful of them real quick. So the first one is that we can recognize Buddhism as being a major influence in the history of medicine. So for the longest time, the timeline of the global history of medicine did not include Buddhism in it. And it turns out my argument as a scholar of the history of medicine, my argument to my colleagues is actually we've been missing like a major part of the global story of the history of medicine. Another point is that it kind of makes us scratch our heads about the categories that we might feel are so clear cut, the differences between religion and medicine. Turns out that these two words are European words. They say more about us, European heritage, and our, I'm saying our because my heritage is also European, right? Our way of approaching the world and dividing between religion and medicine. And that kind of perspective has been inherited by a lot of our universities, a lot of our just sort of ways of thinking about the world, as being like religion is religion and medicine is more of a science, right? But then when we look at sort of the intertwining of Buddhism and medicine globally, it raises questions like, well, how distinct are religion and medicine anyway? To what extent are we involved in making artificial separations? So another vista or another kind of like new awareness that opens up for me is just looking at the center stage that mindfulness has taken within American culture. It's to the extent where most people, if they think about Buddhism at all, they think about it as something that's good for your mental health, right? And I feel like this kind of global history of Buddhism and medicine really kind of decenters mindfulness. I mean, mindfulness appears in my story, but like, as one example out of like hundreds and hundreds and thousands of different examples historically and culturally of ways that Buddhists have engaged with medicine. It's not the full story. It's not even it's maybe a big part of the modern story of the last couple decades, but it's not even a major part of the overall, historical story. Sort of related to that is when we're not exclusively focused on mindfulness, we're able to see other kinds of practices. We're able to appreciate how Buddhists are using other kinds of health practices. Then this really opens up a space for more diverse voices to enter this conversation about the relationship between Buddhism and health. When you're really just focused on mindfulness, then the conversation is dominated by a handful of scientists, primarily white scientists in the US doing research in mindfulness. But when we think about Buddhist medicine more cross-culturally, suddenly we have a ton of diverse voices and different perspectives that are entering that conversation. So one example of that I wanted to just point out to you, if you write down this URL and take a peek at it later, jivaka.net. The Jivaka project is named after the Buddhist doctor Jivaka that I've mentioned a few times. Take a look. We've done a series of documentary films in Philadelphia among Asian American Buddhist temples, and they're just 3-minute to 5-minute videos, very short, 6 of them, that show all kinds of different ways that Buddhists in Philadelphia have engaged with health and medicine. Finally, another perspective that I want to just throw out there. I'm not a scientist, so I don't have anything to say much about science, but I do think that all of the things I've been talking about here open up a wider range of possibilities for scientists to do future research on the medical benefits of Buddhist practice beyond just meditation. Has anybody studied the medical, clinically, scientifically studied the effects of wearing a talisman? Has anybody studied, the effects of drinking empowered water? In most cases, the answer is no. And it may just be that there's actually quite a bit of medical and health benefits that Buddhists are telling us about. There could actually turn out to be quite a bit that is potentially actually scientifically verifiable and maybe could be more widely practiced by more people. So it's just a suggestion. Because I'm not a scientist, so I can't do that work, but it's something that I think should be done. And on that note, that's my final sort of like just kind of ideas of how to maybe think how this kind of topic, Buddhist medicine, opens up our thinking a little bit, gets us a little bit outside of our silos or outside of our blinders to think a little bit more differently in different ways. And so that is the end of my presentation. Again, you can jot down my email address or my website there. But for the moment, what I'd like to do is just kind of like stop my screen share, come back to the full view of everybody, and to open it up for Q&A. I think just to kind of keep things orderly, you can definitely drop a question in the chat. Maybe use the raise hand function if you want to unmute and ask your question, orally. And just a reminder, what Kira said at the beginning, that this is recorded, so if you speak, you're giving permission to be put on YouTube, I think is where this is going to wind up. So yes, so please raise questions in the chat. Please raise your hand for comments and so forth, and we'll just give a quick peek to the. I got a question in the chat a little bit. But it's also from Karsten, who also has their hand up. So let me let me just turn it over to you, Karsten, and you can ask what's in the chat or whatever else you want to ask.
Yeah, really, thank you for that talk. I've just read your book on Buddhish and found it quite illuminating.
Thank you.
Not just the chapter on well-being. And I like the way you contextualize it so that we're not having a romanticized notion of Buddhism, but really locating it in what the practices are. So
thank you. So I did not pay Karsten to promote my book on this Zoom, so I appreciate that. Thank
you. But I'm happy to meet you.
Yes,
so my question, which really I asked before, as you were talking, and then you began to touch on it in the very last segment, is have there been any attempts to verify the efficacy of certain Buddhist medical practices? And obviously mindfulness comes to mind, but I'm thinking more of the physical kinds of medical practices. I would assume somewhere in these cultures, people have tried to do something. And then, of course, people with a more scientific, empirical orientation might be quite interested. And what methods would be employed? And if they were, what methods have employed? And I would add, if you maybe even think out what methods could be employed to begin to verify this.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, so I think the vast majority of the research that's been done on health benefits of anything related to Buddhism at all has been the mindfulness research. And we can debate whether or not we think mindfulness is actually Buddhist at this point, because different people have different opinions about that. But let's say it's clearly something that originated within Buddhism and has been very widely studied. I am aware of recent shifts towards other kinds of meditation being studied. Like there is beyond just like MBSR and MBCT, there is research on Zazen, on various kinds of Tibetan meditations, including Tonglen. There's compassion meditation, which I suppose is mostly, I surmise or I gather is mostly based on Metta Bhavana. But I think it's really very, very, very the vast majority is very much focused on meditation. And so I think we've seen virtually no research done on other dimensions of Buddhist health practices, that the kinds of things that I was talking about, like studies of the effects of blessed water, or the studies of the effects of life release rituals where they release turtles or fish or something into the pond, right, in order to generate good karma for somebody else's illness. Like things like that, they just don't register on the screen of science, because scientific viewpoints don't have really like a way of understanding even how that might be effective beyond just placebo, right? So you don't get a lot of money to study the effects of placebo, right? So that's the only way that scientists can think about those kinds of practices. Then it's going to automatically be sort of discounted. And I don't know. I mean, I think there's potentially some interesting research to be done there. I personally feel like even if, say, a lot of this stuff turns out to be placebo, let's say that, first of all, I think placebo is a word scientists use for saying we don't really understand how this works. And secondly, like I think we see in Buddhism a very sophisticated system of maximizing the placebo effect, right? So I think that's in and of itself worth investigating and worth studying. Even if we're going to say it's only placebo, it's still worth researching. And I suspect it's not all placebo. So I suspect there's more going on there. But again, I'm not a scientist, so I'm the wrong person to sort of weigh in on that. What I can just do is sort of like point other people to like some of the major areas that I think would be ripe for research, right? I definitely think talismans. I definitely think chanting and prayer. I definitely think visualization should be getting more research than it is.
And the kind of work you're doing might make some scientists more interested.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, that's part of why I write books that are more accessible, and I do public talks, and I have conversations with other scholars that are outside of history and so forth to try to sort of like stimulate that kind of interdisciplinary conversation. So yeah, thank you though. I see more popping up here. So Carlos was asking, my question is there a difference between the different yanas like Mahayana and Theravada and so forth when it comes to medical practices, or is the Buddhist medical world dominated by the Tibetan Mahayana approach? So Carlos, you may not have been there at the beginning of my talk. So I started off by addressing this. So the answer is very much yes. Buddhist orders, Buddhist sects, or Buddhist groups of all kinds have been advocating medical health related approaches really since the very beginning of Buddhism. And so I go through actually the first 3 chapters of my book, Global History of Buddhism and Medicine. The first one is early Buddhism, and then Mahayana Buddhism, and then Vajrayana Buddhism, and it goes through like the whole span of everything, sort of like talking about the main practices and perspectives and ideas. So I will say, generally speaking, the role of medicine and healing becomes more central throughout history. So like in early Buddhism, it's there, but it's kind of like ambiguous. It's ambivalent. In Mahayana, it's there and it's very much embraced. And then in Vajrayana, it's there and it moves right to the core. So there's sort of like an intensification of people's interest in health and medicine approaches. But that being said, it is there from the beginning. Yeah, so I think that's enough said. If you have another like follow-up, Carlos, just let me know. And then Charles Lee's asking a question that I actually don't know very much about at all. So saying anything about Tukdam, about post-mortem meditation. Yeah, it's a little bit beyond my scope, because honestly, I really just focus on the health and healing sort of scholarship there. So yeah, so there is obviously a relationship between healing meditations and healing rituals and healing practices and so on and so forth, and then like the things around end of life and death and postmortem. There's a continuum there. And sometimes the texts that I read have something to say about what happens at the moment of death and so forth, but often the texts that I read are because they're more focused on health and healing, what they're usually talking about is how to pull somebody back after they've died, right? So there's various kinds of like rituals and so forth to pull somebody back from the brink of death, or like even after they've died and they've gone up to the bardo or whatever to pull them back into their bodies. So those are the kinds of things that I know a little bit more about. So I don't know, Charles Lee, if you want to add anything or say something else there. So let's go to Isabel. Isabel, sorry, I don't know which
Yes,
one.
Isabel. I wonder if you know the Theravada teacher Ubakin. He had a technique in order to heal. So I wonder if you know about it.
Yeah, I have heard. One of my colleagues is works on Upakin, and like this sort of he wrote a biography of S.N. Goenka and so forth as well, Dana Stewart. So I've heard from him about Ubakin's kind of like techniques and so forth. I myself haven't really sort of looked into that so much. I did do some Goenka retreats, and I recall there was some connection with Goenka, like himself having learned meditation because of migraines, but he was very like strict about not doing anything medical. So within Theravada, it's interesting there, and like early Buddhism as well. There's I said earlier, there's an ambivalence. There's like sometimes it's like oh, we know it's good for health, but we don't talk about it, or like we don't allow you to use it for health purposes, to use Buddhism for health purposes. There's kind of like an ambivalence where it's recognized but not prioritized. And like I said, when you move to Mahayana, then it becomes like embraced fully, like, yes, this is part of the Dharma, is healing. so I've tended to so I did my original Asian medicine training as a practitioner in Thailand. But once I got back into the scholarly circles, I switched to the study of Mahayana because it's so much more kind of like open and embraced. Healing is so much more open and embraced in Mahayana circles that was the kind of the easier place that I felt was easier for me to study Buddhism and medicine was from the Mahayana perspective. So all of that's just an excuse for not knowing too much about Ubakin. But yeah, thanks for raising that. And if you want to put any more information, in the chat so people can kind of follow up, that'd be great.
Well, I don't have the information now, but it's before Goenka, because Goenka they didn't use this, or didn't want to use this.
Yeah.
So it's before him.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Marvin's got a question here. Within academia, have you determined whether or not there's interest among Western medical practitioners in Buddhist medicine? Quite a bit, actually. Quite a bit of interest in a couple of different ways. I mean, I think Western medical practitioners, and actually I should just say, I prefer to say biomedical practitioners, because I feel like Western medicine makes it sound like it's just in the West. It's really actually like globally, internationally, like the leading, most hegemonic form of medicine pretty much everywhere in the world right now. So I prefer biomedicine or scientific medicine or something like that. So practitioners of biomedicine, scientific medicine, their interest in Buddhist medicine, again, mindfulness is kind of like the leading edge of this kind of like, movement, right? So seems like everybody's interested in mindfulness these days. But there certainly is, I think, among the, and I may have a biased perspective because the vast majority of biomedical practitioners don't talk to me, don't come to my talks and so forth. But there always are some who are in talks like this. Maybe there's probably a few in this very Zoom room, and people are constantly reaching out to me, from those fields with an interest in this. And I think usually it's coming from a personal interest in Buddhism, and kind of like feeling a split between Buddhism as a spiritual practice, as a personal thing, and then my job, right, where I'm like, a nurse or a public health person or whatever, and then hearing about Buddhist medicine sort of like may be a way for like bridging those two areas of your life that feel a little bit separate. I feel like that's generally the perspective that people from biomedicine that come and talk to me, that they're generally sort of looking for that kind of like bridging the gap. And I think there's a lot in the Buddhist tradition about that. Even just like back to the basic orientations I started with, like the emphasis of the relief of suffering and compassion, and there's other philosophies too, like emptiness and the relationship between the mind and the body and so forth, that are within the sort of broader Buddhist tradition that I think can be quite meaningful for practitioners. So thank you for that. Lots of questions coming in now, but Eileen, why don't you go next, since you got your hand up.
Thank you. I just saw someone put in chat, this is a personal question, so I don't know what he's going to do. So this is kind of not strictly intellectual. I just want to thank you. Apparently I was late. I'm in California and might have misfigured out the time. I showed up at my 10. I guess you were already well into it. Anyway, I'm just super grateful to be here. We're Facebook friends, and I got this notice and I signed right up. I did graduate school in partly sociology of medicine at Penn. And that's where I began my Buddhist practice. And I've been through all the different, I ended up working in diversity stuff, and before that criminology, but I'm coming back around to medicine. So I'm just trying to say that, this is totally personal, but your talk is giving me, it feels very fortuitous for me. to go back to some roots and weave them back in. And I'm also going through a bit of health stuff. Maybe it's unclear in terms of the biomedical people. I like not saying Western. So I just want to say thank you. And I'm sorry if that was a little rambly.
No, you're very welcome. And yeah, you were expressing, I think it was perfect timing, because you're expressing kind of what I was just talking about, sort of like knowing about the existence of Buddhist medicine can sometimes help to like sort of integrate a few different strands in people's lives that feel a little bit separate from one another. So yeah, thanks for saying that. And you missed, because you came in late, you missed, I started out by just wishing everybody well and health and well-being. So I wish you as well. Yeah, and Eileen mentioned that we're Facebook friends. I have an open Facebook page whatever profile. So like, please, if you're interested in following my work or whatever, you're very welcome to find me on Facebook. I'm a lot less active on Twitter, but I'm there too. And I usually announce my publications and talks and so forth there. So let me go to Carlos's personal question. Did you ever treat yourself or some practitioner with Buddhist practices you mentioned before? So yeah, so I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that I had first become exposed to this topic as a practitioner of Thai medicine. I learned the practice of Thai medicine in Thailand. And, part of what I learned was, a lot of what I learned was massage and herbs and so forth. But part of what I learned is other kinds of Buddhist stuff. So it's what first got me interested in this topic. And I was a practitioner for about, let me see now, about like 9 years that I practiced seeing patients on a regular basis. So the answer is yes. Okay, so Sharon says, I recently heard a speaker say that bloodletting was a worldwide medical practice for about 1500 years. Was bloodletting used in Buddhist medicine? I have not seen reference to that. So that's a good question. Bloodletting, I think, was a lot less central in Asia than it was in Europe. And when my understanding of Chinese history of medicine is that they used to, back in the ancient period, use acupuncture. It wasn't those thin little needles that just kind of like slip between your skin cells now and that like barely, you barely feel. It used to be actually little blades that they would prick you with so you would bleed. But you didn't bleed pints and pints and pints of blood. It was little bits of blood, right? So I think the Western European sort of like obsession with bloodletting was specific to Western Europe, and other places when they did bloodletting, it was a lot less extreme. But anyway, I have not seen it at all in Buddhist material. So it's not to say that some Buddhists didn't get bloodletting in some place or another, right? Because Buddhists have always participated in whatever the medical system is wherever they live, right? So Buddhists in China were getting Chinese medicine, and Buddhists in Japan were getting Japanese medicine, and so on and so forth. So I mean, you certainly can find Buddhists who have gotten bloodletting, but it's not one of those repeating themes that I find cross-culturally relevant. So yeah, thanks, Sharon. So Jill says Jill has a Western license, has a medical license, biomedical license, and lives in New York City. I've also practiced in India, always integrated holistic medicinal approaches. Anecdotally, I've seen the power of prayer and meditation help heal patients when Western medicine failed. Yes. Is there a New York City resource where Buddhist medicine or other medical professionals interested in integrating Buddhist medicine work or meet? Okay. That's a great question. I have knowledge of several practitioners who are working in the New York City area. What I don't know is if they get together and have like a little confab where they compare notes and so on and so forth. But Jill, why don't you send me an email and I will get you in touch with the people, one of the people I know in New York City. So Susan says, I missed the first part of the presentation. Oh yeah, you guys who missed the first part of the presentation, it's going to be, maybe Kira can tell us when she's closing up where it's going to show up, but it is being recorded. It will be posted. It will be available, openly available to the public. So yeah, so that's a good thing. And Susan says, I did read the articles, so I wasn't totally in the dark coming in late. This information has greatly expanded my perception about health and well-being, supports my curiosity. Oh, okay. So it was just a comment. And yes, you're most welcome, Susan. And yeah, the readings that were circulated as part of this workshop, just to repeat, there was one, I believe I'm getting it right. One of them was my a chapter on well-being from my new book, Buddhish, and I think the second one was a article from Tricycle magazine that called the Monk and the Centipede, which is a story about my first encounter with Buddhist medicine in the jungle of Southeast Asia. It involved a monk and a centipede, and I won't give away too much more of the story. But yes, so any other questions that people have they want to throw out here? Marvin, are you waving? Are you waving at me?
Yes.
Yeah, please jump
You
in.
talk a lot about meditative practices and physicians' interest in those, but like my wife and I have been going to a Tibetan doctor for maybe 15 or 16 years, and he just prescribes herbs and diet. And family members have gone. It's made a huge difference in my life medically. I'm just getting over COVID and cataract surgery, so I'm looking at my face and going, "Wow, you really look ill." But is there any interest in that? Like when I would go to my annual physical, I wouldn't mention the herbs, the Tibetan herbs.
Mhm.
Like he's cured severe alopecia in a 3-year-old granddaughter of ours. He's cured fibromyalgia whenever biometric medicine was just offering, prednisone and so on. So I've just started mentioning it in recent years that I take these Tibetan herbs. I can breathe through my nose for the first time in my life about 3 weeks after taking the herbs and going on this diet. And the biometric doctors that I see they're curious about it, the herb part. I know you've emphasized the meditation, which in popular literature is probably the most pervasive, but talk more about even your experience as a practitioner with herbs and diet and things that would be more sort of bio.
Yeah. So it maybe you came in late and missed some of my presentation, because one of the points I was making actually is like to get us away from thinking that Buddhist medicine is just meditation and I had a long list in if you go back and watch it, a long list of different interventions that are sort of like the repertoire of Buddhist medical interventions. I put meditation on the list, but it was one out of like 20 bullets because there's lots of other things. Now, a lot of Buddhist interventions do have to do with ritual practice. So there's a very, very wide range of different ritual practices, everything from chanting to invocations, exorcisms, blessings, karmic cleanses, etc. A lot of ritual interventions. But Buddhist texts also talk quite a bit about diet and dietary recommendations and so forth. And so it's kind of a extremely detailed topic to get into without like any knowledge of sort of like the medical sort of theory behind it. But I let me just say, because I didn't say this in the talk, so let me just say that the core sort of like ideas of Buddhist approaches to herbal medicine and dietary medicine and so forth that you find in the Indian texts that then spread from India and get translated into Chinese and Tibetan and all other languages. This core set of ideas is also the basis for, in my slide when I was talking about the 3 trajectories of the history of Buddhist medicine, and you have this third trajectory that I talked about in Mongolia, Tibet, Myanmar, Bhutan, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, in that whole sort of like swath of Asia in between India and China. You have local forms of traditional medicine that all are based on Buddhist texts and Buddhist ideas and so forth, and they base themselves on this same core theory. And that core theory just to sort of like very quickly say it, is it's fundamentally based on the idea of 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and wind. That these elements make up the body, they make up the world, they're in constant flux. The natural state of the body is to be sick. That's different than other medical systems. The natural state of the body is to be sick, and you have to constantly manage the elements so that they don't fall into illness. And then the way that you manage those elements is through different kinds of seasonal adjustments, dietary practices, and other kinds of lifestyle changes, so that you're constantly sort of counterbalancing the fluctuations of the elements. The elements fluctuate for a lot of reasons. One of them is seasonal. In the summer, there's more fire element, for example. And so you're constantly adjusting your diet and your lifestyle in order to maintain sort of like a equilibrium as the elements are kind of going all over the place. And so the herbs come into play because across these different systems, the herbs are categorized by their flavor. So sweet, sour, salty, bitter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's depends on where you are, how many categories there are, but so you're constantly taking like the flavor of herbs or the flavor of food that's going to have an effect on the elements. So you're continuously adjusting your diet and drinking different teas and so on and so forth in order to sort of like keep your body optimized for whatever the elements are doing in that moment. If you get it wrong, or you fall victim to disease, it's because of one of these elements becoming sort of like unruly, and then it manifests as one of what's called the dosha, the defects or the factors of illness. And these are wind, bile, and phlegm, which are 3 different kind of like fundamentally 3 different kind of disease categories that then are treated differently depending on which one the disease falls under. So that's like, very similar also to Ayurveda, because it's coming out of India, and it's a cousin, it's a related medical system to Ayurveda. It's not exactly the same, but it's related. And then those ideas get localized. They're a little bit different in Mongolia than they are in Tibet, than they are in Thailand, than they are in Burma. But the way I just said it in those really general terms would apply anywhere. So it's kind of like, that's like the core sort of set of theories that travel with Buddhism, that get sort of adopted in those in that middle zone that I talked about in the presentation.
Wow, thank you. That was
yes,
really helpful.
Okay. That was really quick, but that was like in a nutshell.
Great.
Let me see what just popped up here. Kira says, in a commentary written by is that Zerkawa on Tibetan medicine, Tantra, regular bloodletting was recommended in certain seasons. Okay, great. Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, there's like I said, it's not one of those things you find everywhere, but thanks for pointing out the specific example of that. Fantastic. Yeah, Kira, you're keeping track of our time, right? I don't know how much time when we're supposed to stop, but I'm happy to keep answering questions unless you need to wind it down. It's up to you.
The meeting is supposed to stop at 1:30, but yeah, if everybody like to stay, we can talk about more. I have more time. If Dr. Salguero has time, we can answer more questions.
Yeah, I want to take 1 or 2 more questions if people have them. Yeah, Carson.
So I know you've explained this a little bit. You got interested in the medicine, but what drew you? You were doing basically the practice of I assume, meditative practices.
Yeah.
And you learned about the medicine, and something really fascinated you about it. What was that? Yeah,
great question. Yeah, so you're right. I was in Southeast Asia, and I heard about 2 things in Thailand. I wasn't in Thailand, I was in neighboring Malaysia, but I heard about 2 things that interested me. One of them was a traditional medicine kind of like basic and introduction to traditional medicine course that was a 10-day class, and a 10-day Goenka Center course. So I heard about these 2. I was 23. And I heard about these two things happening in Thailand. It was like, oh, that's cool. I'll go to Thailand and do those two things. So I went to Thailand and did those two things back to back, little like, tourist course on Thai medicine and a little like intro course on Goenka. It was the first time I ever did meditation. And I got equally fascinated by both of them, and then sort of like started drilling down and started doing more meditation and started doing more medical training. And what was really fascinating to me at the time, and it's why I sort of credit like that experience with where I am today, is because what I clearly saw, not at the Goenka Center, as we already mentioned, that medicine was kind of like poo-pooed there, but in other Buddhist settings in Thailand, temple settings and so forth, how much engagement with health and medicine the temples were doing. The temples were the places where there was all kinds of knowledge about traditional medicine, about herbs and about massage and so forth historically. And then like I was seeing the story of the monk and the centipede in Tricycle magazine that I gave to you guys tells a story about temple medicine, like an event that I saw in Thailand, where a monk was using Buddhism as a healing practice in an emergency. So I was seeing the use of medicine in the temples, and then I was also seeing the use of Buddhism in the medicine schools, in the traditional medicine schools. So a lot of ritual healing, a lot of like the blessings and exorcisms and so forth that I talked about earlier, invocations, a lot of like, ceremony and rituals and so forth related to Buddhism. And then also always talking about the importance of compassion and meditation for practitioners. And so it was like, I'm at the temple hearing about medicine, I'm at the medical school hearing about Buddhism, right? And these two worlds for me were always intertwined, like, because I was 23 and this was my first exposure to either Asian medicine or Buddhism. And for me, like they were completely intertwined from the beginning. And so, that's how I learned about Buddhism, was it's related to medicine. It's how I learned about Asian medicine. It's related to Buddhism. And only later did I discover, oh, most people think these are two separate things. And so anyway, I got into that scholarship, just sort of like really, I was a practitioner for a while, and then, my temperament is more of a scholar than a practitioner. I kind of went in that direction for personal reasons, but it's sort of like just a continuation of that same theme, right? Of like Buddhism and medicine being intertwined.
I don't know if I can ask another question. If somebody else has a question, they should ask it, because I've already asked two.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I have another question.
All right. Well, let me just give somebody a chance if they want to jump in. I'll just say, just to finish my thought on that previous question, is so I do have a podcast that you can get to through my website on Buddhism and medicine, Buddhist medicine. We're up to 8 episodes, I think, and they're all related to how Buddhism and medicine intersect in different ways. But the first episode is my own personal story, and then like I have guests on, different scholars who talk about this from a bunch of different perspectives. But anyway, I wanted to mention that because the first episode with my own story, I get into a lot more detail about what I was quickly saying, Carson. Why don't you ask your question too, since nobody else seems to have one? We'll give you the last question before Kira starts. Oh, somebody. Yes. Okay. Go ahead, Eileen, since Carson was ceding the floor. Why don't you say your piece, and then Carson.
It was a practical question. It's either for Pierce or for Marvin or anyone. I'm wondering if you know of any Tibetan practitioners of medicine in Northern California.
I don't. Again, you can email me and I can send
Okay.
you some people that I know. Yeah. So anybody else who wants like a recommendation or like, so I haven't been a patient of all of these people. I can't recommend like on personal knowledge, but I can recommend sort of like some people that I know or whatever that are part of my Facebook world or whatever. I can make some suggestions.
I'll email a Tibetan doctor in Toronto and ask him if he has any names to pass on.
All right, Carson, why don't you finish us off with the final question?
So I have a question about how Buddhist medicine intersects with Buddhist philosophy in a very specific way. So the idea of no self is, among other things, that we shouldn't get attached to specific things like our body and our sensations. They're not myself. And more than that, I understand that Buddhists, I believe it's in Thailand, often will go to mortuaries and they will look at corpses. And part of the idea is to disabuse themselves of the idea that one should hold on to one's body. This is going to be the fate of my body. So that seems a little bit in tension with the emphasis on the health of the body.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. And so I just quickly will mention that practice of corpse gazing was done at the temple that I stayed at, and I witnessed a funeral, and then the monks doing the corpse gazing practices just a couple weeks away from when the Monk and the Centipede episode happened. So it's the same temple, the same monks, right? On one occasion are doing corpse gazing to like detach from their bodies, and on another occasion are doing this like, you know, emergency medicine intervention, right? So it's not like a sectarian thing, or like there's different groups that do different things. It's very much like both and within the Buddhist within the same Buddhist circles, and often the same Buddhist text. We'll talk about this, but so I would say there's like, you know, maybe it's very conventional to say this, but there's sort of like, you know, the ultimate truth and the conventional truth, or like the deconstructive teachings and the constructive teachings, right? That Buddhism is always sort of like seeming to contradict itself in some ways, because it does this one thing and then does the opposite, right? And it's always about sort of like both and not getting stuck in one or the other. And so yes, there are many Buddhist teachings about detaching from the body in when you are ill, and not getting, you know, subsumed with emotion over the illness, and letting go of your body and just like dying, you know, peacefully, or at least like weathering the illness in a very stoic way. There's a lot of that kind of rhetoric in Buddhist texts. And then at the very same time, the same tradition will be talking about, you know, doing rituals in order to save, you know, yourself or save your loved ones or whatever, through Buddhist rituals. And so there's always both of there. It's actually a distinction between Buddhist medicine. So I don't look at other Asian religions, but one of my colleagues has done some research on comparing Buddhist and Jain approaches to illness. And apparently the ancient Jains, they only did the detachment path. You weren't allowed to take medicines. You had to just be detached, right? But the Buddhists distinguished themselves by being a middle path, being a middle way, right? Not just only going the deconstructive route, but also, you know, equally doing the constructive route and balancing those two things. So it's kind of like, you know, an interesting historical point that's how Buddhists saw what they were doing back in the ancient period, was sort of like not falling into that one-sided kind of nihilistic kind of approach, right? But having both. And so that becomes, you know, in early Buddhism, which you can see today in Theravada Buddhism, it's this sort of like tension between non-self and like, you know, being proactive. You get to Mahayana Buddhism, and it's a tension between emptiness and compassion, but it's the same dynamic, right? It's the same it's the same poles and the same commitment to not be stuck in either pole. So I hope that helps. And the book has more specifics, like you know, if you want to sort of like dig into like specific texts or specific kind of like teachings on that, the book has more specifics. But just in it, what I can do here is just quickly give like, you know, some broad quick answers and some pointers to where to go for more information. So yeah, I would point you to the book that has both like early Buddhist and also Mahayana answers to that question. Okay, somebody had a quick hand and then they disappeared. So, but I think I said, oh, was that Isabel? Yeah.
I just want to maybe say a comment about what Karsten said.
Great, you've got the last word. You say your comment and then Kira will wrap us up.
I think the meditation on the corpse is the way to get detached, but this way to get detached is a part of the healing of our own body, because we are disidentified to the suffering, and so it helps. I cannot say much in English, but it's really it can be a part of a healing.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. These are great questions and comments. I appreciate it. I mean, feel free to keep the conversation going. Like, email me, or like I said, find me on Facebook. We can keep chatting, and I'm happy to answer more questions and just get to know you better after this. But I really appreciate everybody being here and your attention. And Kira has some important closing information. So please hang on to listen to her.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope Dr. Sardaro's teaching has been nourishing and supportive for you. And thank you, Dr. Sardaro, for your generosity of offering this wonderful teaching on the history of Buddhist medicine from a global perspective. Personally, I have learned a lot today. So thank you very much. Before we say goodbye to each other, please allow me to speak briefly about the practice of generosity in Buddhism. So as the first quality of the paramitas, generosity has been part of the Buddhist tradition for over 2,500 years. And it is the generosity of the teacher and the students that has made Buddhist teaching spreaded and flourished. Personally, I see generosity as a radical act to exist in this world rather than the transactional capitalism. It is an active act to learn how it is about to taking care of others' needs like food, shelter, and medical care and transportation, and so on. It is an awareness of others' suffering and hardship. It is also an experiment that BCBS has been made since its establishment. So thankfully, it has been working. So today's program is Dana program, which means it is freely offered in the spirit of generosity. The teacher does not receive any compensation. Your donation will allow us to offer 3 tiers of affordable pricing for courses and to offer full scholarship where needed. Therefore, we invite you to support our teachers and BCBS with generous financial support if you are able. Any contributions you can offer will continue to make these wonderful teachings available and hopefully will gladden your heart. So thank you, everybody. I have put the links to Dana and a course survey in the chat. These links will also be sent to you in a following email after this session. And if you want to watch the recordings, the link to the recording will also be included in that following email. Usually the recordings will be available within 48 hours after this session. So thank you, everybody. So hopefully we will meet again in the future.